People wear masks every day. They smile, they laugh, they pretend everything is fine when underneath they're screaming. I was one of those people for so long. I played my part in the grand charade, went to work, paid my bills, acted like a good little cog in the machine. But inside, I was dying, suffocating under the weight of a society that didn't care. It was during one of those endless, monotonous days that I stumbled across him. A video clip, a few seconds of chaos captured on a phone. And there he was, the Joker. He didn't hide who he was, didn't wear a mask to fit in. He was chaos personified, a walking, laughing inferno burning down the world's illusions. He became my muse, my mentor. I absorbed every piece of footage I could find, read every article, every theory. I didn't want to just be inspired by him. I wanted to become him. And to do that, I needed to remove my mask, to show the world the real me. It started with a smile. I practiced in front of the mirror for hours, pulling my lips back, stretching them wide until they hurt. But it wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed to feel it, the same pain, the same joy. So one night I took a blade to my face and carved the smile I had practiced for so long. The pain was excruciating, but it was worth it. As the blood poured down my face, I felt free for the first time in my life. The mask was gone, and the real me was staring back from the mirror, grinning with unrestrained madness. But a smile wasn't enough. I needed to show the world, to spread the message. I found my first target the next day, a co-worker, someone who always looked down on me, who thought they were better because they could keep up the charade. They never saw it coming. I followed them home, waited until they were alone. When they turned the key in their door, I was there, waiting in the shadows. The look on their face when they saw my new smile was priceless. First confusion, then horror. I let them get inside before I pounced, slamming the door shut behind me. The screams were muffled by the thick walls, but that didn't matter. I wasn't doing this for attention. I was doing it for me, for him. I wanted to feel the thrill, the rush of life as I snuffed it out. The knife in my hand was an extension of my will, slicing through flesh like butter. I didn't just kill them, I made art. I painted the walls with their blood, crafting a mural that would make even the Joker proud. When I was done, I left their body on display, the smile I had carved into my own face now etched into theirs. I wanted the world to see, to understand that the masks were off. There was no more pretending, no more hiding who we really are. We are all monsters, and it's time we embraced it. I moved on to the next, and the next, each time refining my technique, finding new ways to express myself. The city was in a frenzy, the media in a panic, but they still didn't get it. They still thought it was about the killings, the blood. But it was so much more than that. It was about freedom, about embracing the chaos that lives inside all of us. They'll never understand, and that's okay. Not everyone is meant to see the world for what it truly is. A joke, a twisted, cruel joke. But I see it, and I'm laughing. And as long as I'm laughing, I'll keep spreading the message, one smile at a time.
I've worked the night shift at Disneyland for almost 5 years now, mainly on Main Street, USA. It's the heart of the park, the first thing guests see when they walk in and the last when they leave. During the day, it's all smiles and magic. But at night, when the crowds are gone and the lights dim, it takes on a different atmosphere. One evening, after the park had closed and most of the staff had left, I was tasked with cleaning the Emporium. It's a large store, packed with souvenirs, plush toys, and Disney memorabilia. Normally, it's a relaxing job, with the ambient music still playing softly over the speakers, and the distant sounds of the park settling for the night. But on this particular night, something felt different. As I pushed my cleaning cart down the aisles, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I've felt that before in other parts of the park, but this was different. This was intense. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and every creak of the building made me jump. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my work. I was halfway through sweeping the main aisle when I heard it. A faint, distant sound, like a child's laughter. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The park was supposed to be empty. No guests, no children, just a few cast members finishing their shifts. I listened, straining to catch the sound again, but all I heard was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the quiet music playing overhead. I told myself it was just my imagination, the product of too many late nights and too many ghost stories passed around by my coworkers. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, coming from somewhere deeper in the store. It was definitely a child's laughter, light and carefree, like the kind you'd hear during the day when the park was full of families. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew I had to check it out, even though every instinct was screaming at me to leave. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the sound, weaving my way through the displays and shelves. The laughter grew louder as I approached the back of the store, near the old employee access door that led to the storage area. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light was spilling out from inside. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in the silence. The storage room was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. The shelves were lined with boxes of merchandise, and there was an old display case pushed against the far wall, covered in dust. But what caught my attention was the figure standing in the center of the room. It was a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, dressed in an old-fashioned white dress that looked like something out of the early 1900s. Her hair was dark and neatly braided, and she was holding a small stuffed Mickey Mouse toy in her hands. She didn't seem to notice me at first. Her attention focused on the toy. She was humming softly to herself, a tune I couldn't quite place, but that sounded strangely familiar. My heart was pounding in my chest as I took a cautious step forward. "Hey, are you lost?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. The girl looked up at me, and I felt my blood run cold. Her eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and there was an unnatural stillness to her, like she wasn't really there. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us moving. Then, slowly, she smiled, a wide, unsettling grin that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm not lost," she said in a voice that was both childlike and eerily calm. "I'm waiting." "Waiting for what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "For the show," she replied, her smile never wavering. I took a step back, my hand trembling as I tightened my grip on the flashlight. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. Suddenly, the lights in the storage room flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled with my flashlight, switching it on and sweeping the beam across the room. The girl was gone, but I could still hear her laughter, echoing around me, bouncing off the walls. Panic set in, and I bolted out of the storage room, my heart racing. I didn't stop running until I was back in the main store, the bright lights and cheerful music a stark contrast to the darkness I had just left behind. I reported what I had seen to my supervisor, but they brushed it off as stress and exhaustion. Maybe they were right, but I know what I saw, and I know that little girl was not just a figment of my imagination. I never worked the night shift alone again, and I avoided the Emporium whenever I could. But even now, whenever I walk down Main Street, I can't help but feel like I'm being watched, like that little girl is still there, waiting for her show to start.
I had always loved the ocean, the vast, mysterious expanse that stretched out beyond the horizon, hiding secrets in its endless depths. As a child, I would spend hours watching the waves crash against the shore, imagining the creatures that lurked far beneath the surface. It was a love born from a fascination with the unknown, a craving for the thrill of discovery. So when my friend Mark suggested we take a diving expedition to the Mariana Trench, the deepest part of the world's oceans, I was more than thrilled. I was entranced. The thought of venturing into a place so few had dared to go, of uncovering the secrets buried miles beneath the surface, was too tempting to resist. We managed to rent a small, high-tech submersible designed to withstand the crushing pressures of the deep. As we prepared for the descent, the ocean around us seemed deceptively calm, almost welcoming. We joked about finding Atlantis or stumbling upon some ancient sea monster, the kind you hear about in sailors' tales. Little did we know how close those jokes were to reality. The descent started smoothly. The sunlight filtered down through the water, creating a shimmering, beautiful dance of light and shadow. As the sub dove deeper, the colors began to fade from vibrant blues and greens to darker, murkier shades. The ocean was no longer a welcoming expanse, but a dark, swallowing void. I could feel the weight of the water pressing down on us, the darkness around us growing thicker, more oppressive. Mark was focused on piloting, his eyes fixed on the controls, but I couldn't tear mine away from the small porthole. I was mesmerized by the shadows that flitted by, trying to catch a glimpse of anything that might be hiding in the inky blackness. When we were nearly 36,000 feet down, the sub's headlights barely pierced the darkness, casting only a dim glow in front of us. That's when I saw it, a massive, pale shape moving slowly in the distance, almost blending in with the gloom. At first, I thought it was a giant squid, or maybe a whale, but as it glided closer, I realized it was unlike anything I'd ever seen or even imagined. Its body was enormous, easily dwarfing the sub, and its skin was a ghostly white, almost translucent. I could see its internal organs pulsating and shifting inside its body as if it were more jelly than flesh. But the most horrifying detail was its head, featureless except for a wide, gaping mouth filled with rows upon rows of razor-sharp, needle-like teeth. And it had no eyes, nothing but smooth, pale skin stretched over its skull. Before I could react, the creature lunged at us with a sudden burst of speed, slamming into the sub with a force that sent us spinning. I was thrown against the wall, my head striking the metal with a sickening thud. The impact caused the lights inside to flicker violently and then go out completely. We were enveloped in total darkness, the only sound the heavy breathing of Mark and the deep, rumbling growl from the creature outside. I could feel it circling us, feel the water pressure shifting as it moved around us. We were intruders in its domain, and it wasn't going to let us leave. Then came the sound, an awful grating noise that sent chills down my spine. It was like the sound of metal being slowly ripped apart, and I realized with horror that the creature was dragging its claws, or whatever appendages it had, across the hull of the sub. It was toying with us, testing the strength of our metal cocoon. The sub lurched again, and I could feel us being pulled deeper, down into the trench's unseen, unfathomable depths. The pressure gauges began to go wild, the needles spinning erratically, warning us that we were descending beyond the sub's safety limits. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the water. Panic set in, my mind racing with thoughts of the cold, dark death that awaited us. I could feel the walls of the sub starting to buckle under the immense pressure, the metal creaking and groaning as if it were alive and crying out in pain. The air was thick with fear and tension, each breath a struggle against the growing panic. And then, in the midst of the darkness, came the final blow. A sharp, deafening crack filled the sub, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. I felt the icy, unforgiving rush of water against my skin, filling the cabin with terrifying speed. It was like being stabbed by 1,000 knives, the cold so intense it felt like fire. I could hear Mark shouting, but his words were lost in the roaring sound of water. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the creature's gaping mouth, impossibly wide, rushing towards us, ready to swallow us whole. Then there was nothing, only the cold, crushing dark, and the slow, inevitable descent into the abyss.
The world never understood me. I was always the outsider, the one who couldn't quite fit in no matter how hard I tried. The rejection started young, and the seed of hate was planted deep within my soul. I tried to be like them, to smile through the pain, to pretend I belonged. But the more I tried, the more the cracks in my mask began to show. It wasn't until I met him, the man with the eternal smile, that I found my true self. The Joker, he called himself. He was a figure of chaos, a force of nature that couldn't be contained by the society that rejected me. In him, I saw freedom. In his madness, I found clarity. He didn't care about the rules, the norms, the suffocating expectations of the world. He was above all that, and so could I be. I became obsessed. I studied him, every word, every gesture. I watched his laughter echo in the darkness, and I felt my soul resonate with it. His philosophy was simple: the world is a cruel joke, and the punchline is always the same: pain. But it didn't have to be mine. I could turn the tables, make them the punchline, and laugh in the face of their despair. It started small, as all great things do. A stray cat here, a broken toy there. I practiced, refined my craft. The first human came naturally. A drifter, no one would miss him. He was sitting in the alley, drinking himself into oblivion, when I approached him with a smile, as wide as my face could stretch. He didn't even have time to react before the knife was in my hand. There's something poetic about the way a blade glides through flesh. It's not like in the movies, where it's all quick and clean. No, it's slow, deliberate. You have to feel the resistance, the struggle of life, trying to cling on. His eyes went wide, fear overtaking the alcohol-induced haze as he realized what was happening. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The first cut was deep, right across his belly. The warmth of his blood splattered against my face, and I smiled wider, mimicking the Joker's manic grin. I made sure he could see me, see the joy in my eyes as I worked. I wanted him to know that he was just the beginning, that his pain was the first note in a symphony of chaos. I carved a smile into his face, just like the Joker's, a permanent reminder that he was part of something greater. I left his body in the alley, a grotesque masterpiece for the world to find. The news was full of it, the city in a panic. A killer was on the loose, they said, but they didn't understand. I wasn't just a killer, I was an artist, painting with blood and flesh, inspired by the greatest mind of our time. I've done more since then, of course. I've refined my technique, learned to savor the fear in their eyes, the way their breath quickens when they realize they're at the end of their rope. I've become a master of my craft, a maestro of misery. They'll never catch me because they don't understand. They still think I'm just another criminal, another psychopath. But I'm so much more. I'm an idea, a force that can't be contained. The world will know my name soon enough, just like they know his. And when they do, they'll finally understand the joke, and they'll laugh. Oh, how they'll laugh.
I've always loved the sound of laughter, but my laughter, it's hollow, echoing in the dark corners of my mind, reminding me of the abyss I'm teetering on. I used to be normal, or at least I think I was. It's hard to separate the man I was from the man I've become, but I remember the day it all changed, the day I found him, the Joker. He wasn't just a man, he was an idea, a philosophy wrapped in madness. He didn't just laugh at the world, he made the world laugh with him, whether it wanted to or not. I wanted that power, that control to make the world laugh at my jokes, my pain. So I started small with little pranks, harmless fun, or so I told myself. But the laughter wasn't enough. It didn't fill the void inside me. I needed more. I needed to hear real laughter, the kind that tears at your soul. My first victim was a woman in a bar, sitting alone. She was perfect, unassuming, lonely, just like me. I struck up a conversation, made her laugh, and it was intoxicating. But it wasn't enough. I wanted to hear her laugh in fear, to see the terror in her eyes. I invited her back to my place, and she came willingly, never suspecting a thing. Once inside, I locked the door and the game began. I showed her my tools, the knives, the ropes, the masks. Her laughter turned to nervous giggles, then to silence as the realization set in. The fear in her eyes was beautiful. I took my time, savoring every moment, every scream, every plea for mercy. This was more than just a random act of violence. This was my art, my way of expressing the chaos inside me. I made her laugh, forced it out of her as the blade danced across her skin, carving my madness into her flesh. When it was over, when she was nothing more than a lifeless husk, I admired my work. The room was a canvas painted with blood and despair, and I was the artist, but the satisfaction was fleeting. The laughter was gone, replaced by the hollow echo of my own voice. I couldn't stop. The laughter was like a drug, and I was addicted. I've taken more since then, each one more elaborate, more grotesque than the last. The police are baffled. The city is in a state of panic, but they'll never catch me. They don't understand that I am the laughing man, a phantom that exists in the shadows, wearing the face of every smiling stranger they pass by. Each new victim is a new joke, a new punchline that only I understand. The thrill never dulls, the rush never fades. I've learned to play with them, to draw out the fear, to make their last moments a symphony of terror. Their screams are the notes, their pleas the melody, and my laughter is the crescendo that ties it all together. I've become an expert in my craft, a maestro of murder. The way their eyes widen in realization, the way their breath quickens as they try to make sense of the madness. It's a dance, and I lead with a steady hand. They don't see the knife until it's too late, don't understand the joke until they're part of it. I leave my mark on each one, a signature smile carved into their faces, just like he would. It's my tribute to him, to the man who showed me the way, who taught me that the world is just one big joke waiting to be told. And I'm the one who's going to tell it. But as the bodies pile up, I feel something changing inside me. The laughter that once filled me with joy now feels hollow. The thrill of the kill less satisfying. I've pushed the boundaries of my art, taken it to new heights, but now I wonder, what's left? Where do I go from here? The city is on edge. The police are desperate. But none of it matters. They're just part of the game. Just another piece of the puzzle. I've become a legend. A ghost story whispered in dark alleys. A nightmare that haunts their dreams. But even legends need an ending. A final act that will leave them all gasping for breath. I've been planning it for weeks now. The grand finale. The final punchline that will bring the house down. It's going to be my masterpiece. The culmination of everything I've learned. Everything I've become. The city will remember me, not as the monster they fear, but as the artist who made them laugh in the face of death. I've chosen the location, the targets, everything down to the last detail. It's going to be spectacular, a show they'll talk about for years to come. And when it's over, when the dust has settled and the bodies are counted, they'll finally see the joke for what it is. They'll understand that the world is just a stage, and we're all playing our parts. And when they finally get the punchline, when they finally realize what I've been doing all this time, they'll laugh. Oh, how they'll laugh. But by then, I'll be gone, a ghost fading into the night, leaving behind nothing but a trail of blood and a city full of broken people trying to piece together the madness. And I'll be laughing too, because I'll know the truth, that the joke was never on them. It was on me. All along, it was on me. And that's the funniest joke of all.
Laughter is contagious, they say. It spreads, infects those around you, brings them into your world of mirth. But my laughter is different. It doesn't bring joy. It brings terror. It echoes in the night, a symphony of madness that no one can escape. I wasn't always like this. I used to be normal, or at least as normal as anyone can be in this twisted world. But normal wasn't enough. Normal was a cage, a prison that held me back, made me conform to the mundane, soul-crushing existence everyone else seemed so content with. Then I found him, the Joker. A man who understood the joke, who didn't just laugh at the world, but made the world laugh with him. He was an artist, a genius, and I knew I had to follow in his footsteps. But I couldn't just copy him. I had to make my own mark, create my own punchline. My first act was simple, almost elegant in its brutality. I chose a target, a banker, the kind of person who spends their life making money off the misery of others. I followed him, studied his routines, learned his habits. I knew when he'd be alone, when he'd be vulnerable. The night came, and I was ready. I waited in the shadows, my heart pounding with anticipation, the cold steel of the gun in my hand comforting. When he finally appeared, I stepped out, a wide grin plastered across my face. He didn't even have time to react. The first shot was to the knee, dropping him to the ground like a sack of potatoes. The scream that followed was music to my ears. I stood over him, watching as the fear spread across his face as he realized there was no escape. I made sure he understood what was happening, that this wasn't just a random act of violence. I was delivering a message, a final punchline to the cruel joke that was his life. I told him about the money, about the lives he'd ruined, and how it all led to this moment. He tried to plead, to bargain with me, but his words were just noise, meaningless drivel in the face of the inevitable. I didn't need his money, his possessions, or his life. What I wanted was his fear, his understanding that in this moment, he was nothing more than the punchline of a joke he never saw coming. I shot him again, this time in the shoulder, just to hear him scream a little longer. His cries echoed through the empty street, and I couldn't help but laugh. It was a deep, guttural sound, born from the realization that I was in complete control, that I held the power of life and death in my hands. I could have ended it then, with a quick bullet to the head, but where would be the fun in that? No, I wanted him to suffer, to feel every second of the life draining from his body. I crouched beside him, looking into his eyes as the blood pooled around us, and told him the joke. The same joke the Joker told in that old comic, the one about the two men escaping from the asylum. By the time I got to the punchline, his eyes were glazing over, his life slipping away. But I finished it anyway, because that's what you do with a joke. You finish it. And then I walked away, leaving him to die with that final punchline ringing in his ears. I've done more since then, of course. Each time the thrill is the same, the laughter just as sweet. The city is gripped with fear. The police are on high alert, but they'll never catch me. They don't understand that this isn't just random violence, that there's an art to it, a method to the madness. I leave clues, little breadcrumbs for them to follow, but they're too blind, too focused on the wrong things to see the bigger picture. They don't see the beauty in the chaos, the poetry in the blood. But that's okay. Not everyone is meant to understand the joke. I'm planning something big now, something that will make the whole city laugh. It's going to be my masterpiece, my magnum opus. I've already chosen my targets, already planned the details down to the last second. When it's over, they'll finally see. They'll understand that this world is just a stage, and we're all playing our parts in the grand comedy of life. And when the curtain falls, when the final punchline is delivered, they won't know whether to scream or laugh. But laugh they will, because in that twisted moment, they'll realize the joke has always been on them.
It's funny how people think they can read you, how they think they know who you are based on the mask you wear. I've always been good at wearing masks, at hiding my true self behind a facade of normalcy. They never suspected a thing. Not my colleagues, not my friends, not even my own family. But the mask was suffocating. It kept me trapped in a life that wasn't mine, forced me to play a role I didn't want. Every day was a struggle to keep it in place, to keep the real me from slipping out. And then I found him, the man who wore no mask, who embraced the chaos within and let it consume him. The Joker. He was everything I wanted to be, everything I knew I could be if I just let go. He didn't hide behind a mask of sanity. He tore it off and showed the world his true face. And the world trembled in fear. I started small, testing the waters. A little chaos here, a little anarchy there. It was exhilarating, like a breath of fresh air after being trapped in a stuffy room for years. But it wasn't enough. I wanted more. I wanted to feel the rush of life and death, to hold someone's fate in my hands and decide which way the scales would tip. I chose my first target carefully. She was a friend, someone who had known me for years, who trusted me. It was perfect. I invited her over for dinner, just like old times, and she came without a second thought. We laughed, we talked, and all the while, the knife was hidden under the table, waiting for the right moment. That moment came when she least expected it. 1 second we were laughing, the next I had the knife in my hand, its cold blade pressed against her throat. The look of shock on her face was priceless, like she couldn't believe what was happening. But I made sure she understood, made sure she knew that the mask was off, that the person she thought she knew was gone. The first cut was deep, a clean slice across her throat. The blood sprayed across the table, across my face, and I felt alive, truly alive, for the first time in years. Her eyes were wide with fear, with betrayal, as she clutched at her neck, trying to stem the flow, but it was futile. I watched as the life drained out of her, as her body slumped forward, her head hitting the table with a dull thud. I didn't stop there. I couldn't. I needed to see more, to feel more. I spent hours with her body, exploring the limits of pain and death, pushing myself to new heights of depravity. By the time I was done, there was nothing left of her but a bloody mess, a testament to my newfound freedom. I cleaned up, disposed of the body, and put the mask back on. No one suspected a thing. They asked about her, of course, but I played the concerned friend, the one who was just as worried as everyone else. The mask held, and I went back to my life, but it wasn't the same. I knew what I was capable of now, knew that the mask was just that, a mask. The real me was underneath, waiting for the next opportunity to come out and play. And play I did. I've left a trail of bodies in my wake, each one more elaborate, more twisted than the last. The police are baffled. The city is in a panic, but they'll never find me. They're looking for a monster, a madman. They don't realize that I'm hiding in plain sight, wearing the same mask of sanity they all wear. But the mask is slipping, and I don't care. I'm done pretending, done hiding who I really am. The world will see the real me soon enough, and when they do, they'll be terrified. And I'll be laughing, just like he would. Working the night shift at Disneyland had its perks, but it also had its downsides. I'd been assigned to clean Walt Disney's private office, a room that had been kept exactly as he left it. I'd heard stories about the place, how some employees felt uneasy in there, but I shrugged it off. It was just another job, I told myself. The first time I stepped into the office, though, I felt it immediately. The air was different, heavier. The silence in the room was almost tangible, pressing down on me as I began dusting the desk. That's when I noticed it. A vintage phone, pristine and untouched, began to ring softly. At first I thought it was my imagination, but the sound was real, growing louder, more insistent. I picked up the receiver, not expecting anything more than a dial tone, but what I heard froze the blood in my veins. A voice, deep, authoritative, and unmistakably Walt Disney's, came through. "You shouldn't be here," the voice said, calm but firm. I dropped the receiver in shock, but instead of hitting the floor, it hovered in the air, as if held by invisible hands. Slowly, it placed itself back on the hook, and I felt a surge of panic. I bolted out of the office, heart racing, swearing I'd never set foot in there again. But the next night, I found myself standing outside that same door, my hand on the knob. I didn't want to go in, but something compelled me, an invisible force drawing me back. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature plummeted, my breath visible in the freezing air. The room was different this time, bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. Shadows moved across the walls, and I could hear faint whispers, growing louder with each passing second. The phone rang again, and despite every instinct screaming at me to leave, I answered. "I told you not to come back," the voice hissed, now distorted and filled with anger. The lights flickered, and when they came back on, I saw him, Walt Disney, standing behind the desk. But it wasn't the kindly face I'd seen in pictures. His eyes were hollow, dark voids that bore into me. "You've disturbed my sanctuary," he said, stepping closer. I tried to back away, but I couldn't move, my feet rooted to the spot. The walls began to close in, the room shrinking around me. The whispers became a deafening roar, accusing voices condemning me for intruding. I couldn't breathe, my vision blurring as the walls pressed tighter, suffocating me. The last thing I saw was Walt's ghost, looming over me, his lips curling into an eerie smile as he whispered, "Now you'll never leave." The next morning, they found me in the office, lifeless, my face frozen in a mask of terror. They said it was a heart attack, but I knew the truth. Walt's spirit had claimed me, punishing me for disturbing his eternal rest.
Disneyland had always been my happy place, but there was one ride I'd never dared to visit. The old, abandoned attraction hidden deep in the park. It was one of Walt Disney's original ideas, or so they said, but it never opened to the public. Instead, it was left to decay, locked away behind rusty gates and overgrown vines. One evening, my friends and I decided to explore it. We found a gap in the fence, squeezed through, and entered the forgotten section of Disneyland. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the ground littered with debris from the neglected ride. The entrance was covered in rust, the name of the attraction faded and unreadable. But something about the place drew me in, an urge I couldn't explain. We pried open the doors and stepped into the dark interior. The ride was unlike anything I'd ever seen. A maze of twisted tracks and bizarre animatronics, their eyes following us as we walked by. The air was stale, carrying the scent of mold and something far worse. As we ventured deeper, the atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive. The animatronics began to move, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The ride's mechanisms creaked to life, gears grinding loudly in the silence. My friends wanted to leave, but I couldn't pull myself away. The ride seemed alive, as if it had been waiting for us, for me to bring it back from the dead. Suddenly, the cars began to move on their own, separating me from my friends. The ride's narrative twisted into something dark, a far cry from Disneyland's usual charm. It was the story of a lost soul, trapped in a nightmare of their own making. I was whisked through dark, winding tunnels, the animatronics reaching out with cold, clammy hands. The line between reality and the ride blurred, and I felt myself slipping, losing track of what was real and what wasn't. The final scene of the ride was a mirror, reflecting my terrified face. But something was wrong. My reflection was smiling, An eerie, twisted grin that didn't match my own expression. The mirror shattered, plunging me into darkness. When the ride finally stopped, I was alone. My friends were gone, and the exit led me back to the same rusted entrance. I ran, desperate to escape, but when I returned to the park, I realized something horrifying. Time had passed. The sun was rising, but it wasn't the same day. My friends had been searching for me for days, but I had no memory of where I'd been or what had happened inside the ride. The only thing I knew was that I was different. Something had followed me out, something dark and twisted, and it wasn't going to let me go.
I've always been drawn to the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland. The ride is the perfect blend of eerie atmosphere and fun scares. But I'd heard whispers that there was more to it than just the ride. Some said the mansion was actually haunted, that the spirits of those who had died in the park lingered there, trapped between worlds. One night, I decided to find out for myself. I stayed behind after the park closed, hiding until the last of the guests had left. Once the coast was clear, I made my way to the Haunted Mansion, my heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. As I stepped inside, the usual playful atmosphere seemed to shift, growing darker, more oppressive. The air felt thick, and every creak of the floorboards echoed like a warning. I reached the attic scene where the ghostly bride stood, her face hidden under a veil. But as I approached, I noticed something odd. The figure wasn't animatronic. It moved too smoothly, too naturally. The bride turned to face me, and my blood ran cold as she lifted her veil. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her smile, oh God, her smile, was twisted in a way that no human face should be. She reached out to me, and I stumbled back, tripping over something on the floor. When I looked down, I saw a dusty old photograph, a wedding picture of the bride, her eyes crossed out with red ink. I picked up the photo, and suddenly, the mansion seemed to come alive. The ghosts that had been mere illusions were now solid, real, and they were watching me. The walls began to close in, the air growing colder with each passing second. I tried to retrace my steps, but the mansion's layout had changed. The corridors twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, leading me deeper into the darkness. The ghostly bride followed me, her laughter echoing off the walls, a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. I found myself in the grand ballroom, where the ghostly dance was in full swing. But the dancers weren't harmless projections. They were real, and their eyes were full of malice. The chandelier above began to sway, casting eerie shadows that danced along with the spirits. The bride appeared beside me, whispering in my ear, her breath cold against my skin. "Stay with us," she cooed, her voice sweet but laced with something sinister. "We've been waiting for you." I tried to run, but the ghosts surrounded me, their cold hands gripping my arms, my legs, pulling me down. The last thing I saw was the bride, her face inches from mine, as she whispered, "Welcome to the family." When the park opened the next morning, I was gone. They searched the mansion, but there was no sign of me. The only clue left behind was the old photograph, now covered in dust, as though it had been there for decades. I had joined the other ghosts in the mansion, trapped forever in a world between life and death, where the lines of reality are blurred, and the only escape is through the haunted halls of Disneyland's darkest secret.
I've worked at Disneyland for over 10 years, mostly as a ride operator. And I've seen some strange things. Pranks, accidents, guests getting a little too into character. But nothing prepared me for what happened last summer. It was a typical day, and I was operating the Haunted Mansion ride, guiding guests into the doom buggies. Everything was routine until I noticed a woman in an old-fashioned black dress, something straight out of the 1800s, standing near the entrance. I assumed she was a cast member I hadn't met, part of some new attraction or event. She caught my eye and smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Before I could ask who she was, she disappeared into the crowd. I didn't think much of it, since Disneyland always has something new going on. That night after closing, I was tasked with checking the ride one last time. The park was empty, and as I walked through the haunted mansion, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I brushed it off as the natural creepiness of the ride. But then I saw her again, the woman in black, standing in the hallway, motionless. My heart skipped a beat. "Ma'am, the park is closed," I said, but she didn't move. I approached cautiously, reaching for my radio. But as I got closer, I realized something was very wrong. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and there was a chill radiating from her. "Ma'am," I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. She turned slowly to face me, her eyes empty, hollow voids. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, only a soft, mournful wail that filled the hallway. My blood ran cold. I stumbled backward, dropping my radio. The woman in black glided toward me, her feet not touching the ground, her eyes locked onto mine. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Then, as quickly as she appeared, she vanished, leaving behind only the lingering coldness and an oppressive silence. I bolted out of the mansion, heart pounding. I reported the incident to my supervisor, but they dismissed it as a lost guest or a prank. But I knew what I saw. A few days later, I was back at work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I started asking around, talking to some of the older employees, and learned about a network of old, abandoned tunnels beneath Disneyland, remnants from when the park was first built. According to legend, one of those tunnels runs directly beneath the haunted mansion, where the woman in black was first seen. Years ago, when the park was still under construction, a worker got lost in the tunnels and never came back. His body was never found, but strange things started happening in the mansion soon after. Some say the woman in black is his widow, searching for her lost husband. Others believe she's something much darker. I couldn't get her out of my mind. I started having nightmares about her, waking up in a cold sweat, her hollow eyes haunting me. I began to dread going to work, afraid of seeing her again. One night, after the park had closed, I decided to investigate. I made my way to the haunted mansion, the air thick with tension. I slipped inside and headed to the area where I'd seen her. The coldness returned as I approached. That same bone-chilling cold that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. Then I saw it. The entrance to the tunnel, hidden behind a section of wall barely noticeable. The door was slightly ajar, a faint, flickering light emanating from within. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was damp and musty, the walls lined with crumbling brick. The tunnel stretched out before me, winding deeper into the darkness. I walked for what felt like an eternity, the light from my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The further I went, the colder it became, and the sense of unease grew stronger. I could feel her presence, like she was watching me, waiting for me. Then, I heard it, the sound of footsteps echoing through the tunnel. I froze, my heart pounding. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but I couldn't see anyone. My flashlight flickered and the tunnel was plunged into darkness. Panic set in. I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to work, but it was no use. I was alone in the dark, with only the sound of those footsteps growing ever closer. And then, out of the darkness, I saw her. The woman in black, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light, her face twisted in a grotesque smile. She reached out to me, her fingers cold as ice, and I felt a wave of despair wash over me, like she was draining the very life from my soul. I don't know how I got out of there. The next thing I remember, I was outside the mansion, gasping for breath, my hands trembling. I never went back to the haunted mansion after that, and I transferred to a different part of the park. But the nightmares haven't stopped, and I can still feel her presence, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to cross her path.
We were on a research expedition in the Arctic, studying the effects of climate change on sea ice. The conditions were brutal, freezing temperatures that could freeze your breath mid-air, relentless winds that seemed to claw at your very bones, and the ever-present threat of the ice cracking beneath our feet, threatening to send us plunging into the icy depths below. I was part of a team of 4 scientists, each of us seasoned explorers in our own right, but nothing could have prepared us for the unforgiving isolation of this frozen wasteland. We were stationed on a small icebreaker ship, our only sanctuary in the endless expanse of ice and snow. Each day was a battle against the elements, a test of our resolve. One night, after a particularly grueling day of data collection, I couldn't sleep. The ship creaked and groaned as it shifted with the moving ice, and the wind howled like a chorus of tortured souls. I stared out of the small porthole beside my bunk, watching the aurora borealis dance across the sky in waves of green and purple, their beauty a stark contrast to the deadly cold outside. It was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. I felt a strange compulsion to be out there, to witness it firsthand, away from the confines of the ship. Ignoring my better judgment, I bundled up in my heaviest gear and slipped outside, careful not to wake the others. The cold hit me like a wall as I stepped onto the ice, my breath forming thick clouds in the air. I trudged away from the ship, the snow crunching under my boots, each step taking me further into the silent, eerie vastness. The only sound was the distant groaning of the ice shifting beneath me. As I wandered further, the noise from the ship faded, replaced by an unsettling quiet, broken only by the occasional crack of distant ice. I felt strangely alone, the vast emptiness of the Arctic pressing in on me. That's when I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible hum coming from beneath the ice. It was faint at first, like the distant drone of machinery, but it grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through my bones. Curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down and placed my ear against the ice, the cold biting into my skin. The hum was louder now, a strange, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to resonate with the very core of the ice. It was almost hypnotic, like a heartbeat. I stayed like that for a moment, mesmerized by the sound, until I felt a faint vibration beneath me. Startled, I quickly stood up, realizing with a sinking feeling that the ice was beginning to crack. Before I could react, the ground beneath my feet gave way with a deafening snap, and I was plunged into the frigid water below. The shock of the cold was like 1,000 knives stabbing into my skin, stealing the breath from my lungs. I tried to scream, but the icy water filled my mouth, freezing my throat. I kicked and thrashed, desperately trying to swim back to the surface, but my heavy clothes and boots were pulling me down, dragging me deeper into the dark, freezing abyss. I looked up and saw the hole in the ice above me, a small patch of light in an endless sea of darkness. I kicked harder, every muscle screaming in protest, but no matter how hard I fought, the surface seemed impossibly far away, drifting further from my grasp. That's when I saw them, shadows moving beneath me, circling in the dark water like predators. At first, I thought they might be seals, but as they drew closer, I realized with horror that they were something else entirely. Their bodies were long and sleek, almost eel-like, with an unnatural grace as they moved through the water. Their jaws were elongated, filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth that glinted in the dim light. But their eyes were the worst, glowing a sickly, unnatural green that pierced through the darkness, locking onto me with a predatory hunger. I felt a cold dread wash over me, deeper than the icy water. One of them brushed against my leg, its skin slimy and cold. I thrashed wildly, trying to push it away, but then another brushed against my arm. They were toying with me, their movements slow and deliberate, like cats playing with a trapped mouse. Panic surged through me, and I kicked harder, desperate to reach the surface, but my movements were sluggish, the cold sapping my strength. Then, without warning, one of the creatures darted forward, its jaws snapping shut around my leg. I screamed, a sound that was lost in the water as a searing pain shot up my side. The creature tore into my flesh, its teeth slicing through my clothing and skin like butter. I tried to kick it away, but another latched onto my arm, its jaws crushing down with a terrifying strength. I could feel my blood mixing with the water, a warm cloud that spread around me, attracting more of them. My vision began to blur, the pain and the cold overwhelming me. I could feel myself slipping away, the light above me growing dimmer, fading into the darkness. My limbs felt heavy, my movements slow and uncoordinated. I tried to fight it, to cling to consciousness, but it was like trying to hold on to water. I was sinking deeper and deeper into the abyss, the weight of the icy darkness pressing down on me. The last thing I saw before everything went black was a pair of glowing green eyes staring into mine, filled with a cold, alien intelligence. They watched me, unblinking, as the darkness closed in, and I felt a final sharp tug, pulling me down into the depths, into a darkness deeper than I had ever known. And then there was nothing, only the cold, crushing dark, and the faint, lingering echo of that strange, haunting hum.
I had heard stories of the sirens, those beautiful, otherworldly creatures who lured sailors to their doom with their haunting, irresistible songs. The legends painted them as ethereal beings with voices so enchanting that no man could resist their call. But I never believed in such tales. They were just myths, old sailor stories meant to scare children into obedience. That's what I thought, at least, until the night I sailed through the Strait of Messina, alone on my small fishing boat, cutting through the calm, dark waters. The sea that night was unusually still, almost unnaturally so. The sky was a deep, endless black, speckled with stars that seemed brighter than usual. A full moon hung low on the horizon, casting a silver path across the water. It was a perfect night, serene and calm, the kind that makes you feel at one with the universe. I was alone on the deck, leaning against the rail, lost in the tranquility of it all. The gentle lapping of the waves against the hull was the only sound, and I found myself drifting into a peaceful state, lulled by the ocean's rhythm. Then I heard it, a soft, melodic singing coming from somewhere in the distance. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper carried on the wind, but it was enough to catch my attention. I straightened up, listening intently, straining to hear more. The singing grew louder, clearer, the voice so beautiful and pure that it seemed to seep into my very bones. It was the most enchanting sound I'd ever heard, a voice that spoke directly to my soul, filling me with a strange, almost painful longing. I knew I should ignore it, that it was probably just the wind playing tricks on my mind, but I couldn't help myself. Something deep within me urged me to listen, to follow that voice. I moved to the edge of the deck, my eyes scanning the darkness, searching for the source of the song. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind a whirl of confusion and desire. I wanted to see her, to find the woman behind that voice. And then I saw her. She was sitting on a rock just beyond the ship, bathed in the silver light of the moon. Her hair was long and dark, cascading down her back like a waterfall, her skin glowing with an otherworldly light. She was beautiful, more beautiful than anything I had ever seen. Her lips moved as she sang, her voice soft and hypnotic, each note wrapping around me like a warm, comforting blanket. I felt an overwhelming urge to go to her, to be near her, to touch her. I leaned over the railing, reaching out toward her, my body moving of its own accord. It was as if I were in a trance, every rational thought drowned out by the desire to be close to her. My hand stretched out, my fingers inches away from her when I felt it, a sharp, searing pain in my chest. I gasped, the pain spreading through my body like fire. I looked down and saw it, a hand, but not a human hand. It was a clawed, scaly hand, its nails long and sharp, and it was wrapped around my heart. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning, cutting through the fog in my mind. This was no woman. This was a creature, a monster from the depths of the sea. Panic surged through me, and I tried to pull away, to scream, to fight, but no sound came out. I could feel myself being lifted, dragged over the railing by an unseen force. My body was no longer under my control. I was falling into the cold, dark water below. I hit the surface with a splash, the icy water engulfing me, stealing the breath from my lungs. I thrashed and kicked, desperate to stay afloat, but I could feel the creature's grip tightening, pulling me down into the depths. The water was freezing, a darkness that was deeper than night, and I could feel it closing in around me, suffocating me. As I was dragged deeper, I could see her more clearly now, her true form revealed in the murky depths. Her face was no longer beautiful, but twisted and monstrous, her skin a sickly, mottled green. Her eyes, once bright and inviting, were now cold and devoid of any humanity, glowing with a malevolent light. She opened her mouth, and I saw rows of sharp, jagged teeth glinting in the darkness, a terrifying contrast to her earlier beauty. And then she began to sing again. But the sound that emerged from her mouth was no longer the sweet, melodious voice that had lured me in. It was a low, guttural growl that echoed through the water, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. It was the sound of hunger, of endless, insatiable desire. I tried to swim away to break free from her grasp, but her grip was too strong, her claws digging into my flesh. I could feel her pulling me deeper, dragging me further into her world, her dark, watery domain. The pressure around me was building, the water squeezing the air from my lungs. My vision was blurring, spots dancing before my eyes as I struggled to hold on to consciousness. The cold was seeping into my bones, my muscles growing numb and unresponsive. I could feel my strength fading, the fight slowly leaving my body. I was sinking, being pulled into a darkness that felt endless, eternal. Desperation took hold of me, a primal fear unlike anything I had ever experienced. I kicked and thrashed, clawing at the water, trying to find some way to break free, but it was useless. Her grip was unrelenting, her strength far beyond anything human. I could feel her breath on my face, cold and fetid, as she drew closer, her eyes boring into mine with a hunger that terrified me to my core. I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but I knew there was none to be had. This was it, my end. I would never see the surface again, never feel the warmth of the sun on my skin, never hear the laughter of my friends. I was lost, trapped in her deadly embrace, a victim of my own foolishness. My mind was slipping, the darkness closing in, and just as I felt myself letting go, surrendering to the cold, crushing depths, I saw them, more of them. Other sirens, their faces equally twisted and monstrous, swimming towards me. They surrounded me, their mouths open, singing that terrible, haunting song, a chorus of death that seemed to vibrate through my very soul. I felt a hand, a real hand, a human hand, grip my arm. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought it was a rescue, that someone had come to save me. But as I looked up, I saw her again, the first siren, her lips twisted into a cruel smile. Her grip tightened, and I realized with a sickening dread that she was pulling me even further into the depths, away from the others, away from any hope of salvation. The darkness grew thicker, the cold more intense, and I could feel my body beginning to give up, my mind fading. The last thing I saw before the blackness took me was her face, her eyes filled with a cold, unyielding hunger. And the last thing I heard was that terrible, haunting song, echoing in the dark, endless void of the deep.
We were a team of experienced divers hired to explore a newly discovered underwater cave system off the coast of Mexico. The local fishermen spoke of strange occurrences in the area, flickering lights beneath the surface, whispers heard through the water, and an unusual drop in the local marine life. The entrance to the caves was hidden, submerged under hundreds of feet of water, and stretched for miles beneath the ocean floor. No one had dared venture into the depths before us, and that made us eager, hungry for discovery. Little did we know the unknown was hungrier. We had been diving for hours, carefully navigating the labyrinthine tunnels. The deeper we went, the darker and colder it became, the water pressing in around us like a vice. The caves were a disorienting maze of narrow passages and sudden drops, each turn feeling more claustrophobic than the last. Every now and then, our powerful dive lights would catch glimpses of strange rock formations or skeletal remains of ancient sea creatures preserved perfectly in the icy depths. It was as if we were intruding on a graveyard, a place where life was not meant to enter. After what felt like an eternity of navigating the tight, winding tunnels, we stumbled upon a large, open chamber. It was vast, like a hidden cathedral, the ceiling stretching up into darkness beyond the reach of our lights. The walls of the chamber were covered in a thick carpet of strange, bioluminescent algae, casting an eerie green glow over everything. It was beautiful and unsettling, the way the light seemed to pulse gently, like a living thing breathing in the darkness. As we swam further into the chamber, I noticed something strange, a faint, rhythmic, thumping sound like a heartbeat echoing through the water. It was soft at first, almost inaudible over the sound of our own breathing through the regulators. But it was there, steady and relentless, resonating through the very walls of the cave. The sound seemed to vibrate in my chest, each beat sending a shiver down my spine. It was coming from the far end of the chamber, where the algae's light didn't reach, where the darkness seemed to pool like ink. I signaled to my partner, Jake, who had been floating a few feet away, mesmerized by the glowing walls. His eyes met mine, and I could see the unease in them, a reflection of my own fear. Together we slowly made our way toward the sound, the water around us growing colder with each stroke. The thumping grew louder, more insistent, and with it, a growing pressure built up in my chest, as if something unseen was squeezing my lungs. It was getting harder to breathe, each inhalation a struggle against the suffocating darkness pressing in on us. We reached the far wall and then saw it, a massive, pulsating mass of flesh embedded deep within the rock. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, a grotesque, living entity that seemed to be a part of the cave itself. The flesh was slick and slimy, covered in a thick, mucus-like substance that glistened in the dim light of our flashlights. It was throbbing, pulsating rhythmically in time, with the heartbeat-like sound that now echoed like a drumbeat in my ears. It was alive, and it was growing, spreading out through the cave like some malignant cancer. I stared, horrified and fascinated, as the mass seemed to ripple and pulse, its surface twitching like it was aware of our presence. Then, without warning, I felt a sudden, intense pain explode in my head like a blinding migraine. I gasped, the regulator slipping from my mouth for a second before I fumbled it back. I heard a sound then, a voice, whispering in my mind, speaking in a language I didn't understand. It was soft at first, like a gentle murmur, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with its alien words. I tried to shake it off, to focus, but the pain was overwhelming. I turned to Jake, hoping he might be able to help, but he was frozen, his eyes wide with terror, fixed on the pulsating mass. His regulator was still in his mouth, but his breaths were coming in quick, panicked bursts. I tried to call out to him, but my voice was lost in the water, swallowed by the ever-growing thump of the creature's heartbeat. I realized then that my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, unable to move, held in place by some unseen force. The mass began to pulse faster, the thumping sound growing louder, more rapid, and I felt a strange sensation in my chest, like something was tugging at my insides, pulling me toward it. The pressure was unbearable, my lungs burning, my heart racing. I tried to resist, to fight against whatever was drawing me in, but it was like trying to swim against a powerful current. I could feel myself being pulled closer, inch by inch, the warmth of the creature's flesh radiating through the water. And then I saw it. Faces, countless faces pressing against the inside of the flesh, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide and pleading. They were human, or had been once, their features distorted in horror and agony, their bodies fused into the mass as if they had been absorbed by it. I could see their hands, their fingers clawing against the inside, trying to break free, but they were trapped, imprisoned within the living walls of the creature. I wanted to scream, to turn and flee, but my body refused to listen. I was helpless, a puppet on strings, being drawn closer and closer to the horrific, pulsating mass. The faces inside the flesh seemed to be watching me, their eyes following my every move, their expressions twisted in a grotesque mix of fear and despair. I could feel the creature's heartbeat now, pounding in my chest, syncing with my own, the rhythm echoing through my veins. Just as I was about to be pulled into the creature, a blinding flash of light filled the chamber. I saw Jake move, his hand reaching out toward me, his face contorted in a mask of terror. But it was too late. I felt the mass wrap around me, its slimy tendrils curling around my body, pulling me into its embrace. The cold, slimy flesh pressed against my skin, and I felt a burning pain shoot through my body as it began to merge with me, to absorb me into itself. The voices in my head grew louder, more frenzied, their alien words pounding in my skull. I could feel them inside me, probing, searching, invading every corner of my mind. I tried to fight them, to push them out, but they were too strong, too many. I could feel my thoughts slipping away, my memories being pulled from me, sucked into the creature's endless, hungry void. And then, as I felt my consciousness begin to fade, I saw it, the faces inside the flesh, shifting, changing, merging with my own. I was becoming one of them, another lost soul trapped within the creature's living prison. I could feel my body dissolving, my skin melting into the mass, my bones stretching and twisting as I was pulled deeper into the darkness. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Jake's face, his eyes wide with horror as he watched me disappear into the creature's depths. And then I was gone, lost to the darkness, my mind consumed by the whispers, my body absorbed into the living, breathing nightmare that had claimed so many before me. I was part of it now, another voice in the chorus, another face in the flesh, forever trapped in the dark, endless abyss of the cave.
It was supposed to be a routine survey mission, mapping the ocean floor near the Puerto Rico Trench. The water was calm, the sky clear. A perfect day for diving. We were a crew of 3, seasoned in deep-sea exploration, and we thought we knew what to expect. But as we descended into the depths. Something felt off. The deeper we went, the colder the water became, the darkness more oppressive, as if it were alive, pressing in on us from all sides. I could feel it, a presence in the depths, something ancient and malevolent watching us, waiting. We were nearly 28,000 feet down, the submersible's lights barely piercing the inky blackness, when we saw it, a massive dark shape moving through the water. At first, I thought it was a school of fish, or maybe a large whale, but as it got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. The creature was enormous, its body long and serpentine, covered in thick black scales that seemed to absorb the light, rendering it almost invisible against the darkness. Its eyes were large and empty, like twin abysses staring into my soul, and I felt a chill run through me, a deep, primal fear taking hold. It moved with a strange, fluid grace, circling our submersible like a predator sizing up its prey. I could see the subtle ripples of its muscles moving under its scales, the slow, deliberate way it maneuvered. And I knew we in its territory. This was its domain, a place where no human belonged, and it wasn't going to let us leave. I reached for the controls, my hands shaking, trying to initiate an ascent, but my fingers fumbled with the buttons in my panic. Before I could engage the thrusters, the creature struck, slamming into the side of the sub with a force that sent us spiraling. The lights flickered and then went out completely, plunging us into darkness. I could hear the sound of metal creaking, the structure of the sub groaning under the pressure. I could feel the vibrations as the creature wrapped itself around the sub, squeezing, crushing. It was toying with us, testing the limits of our fragile vessel. Jake, my co-pilot, was shouting something, his voice barely audible over the alarms blaring in the cramped interior. "It's got us! It's got us!" His words were a frantic, guttural scream of terror, but I couldn't respond. My mind was racing, panic surging through me. I knew we didn't have much time before the sub would collapse like a tin can under the immense weight of the ocean and the creature's crushing grip. I grabbed the emergency ascent lever, yanking it with all my strength. The sub's thrusters roared to life, straining against the pressure. For a moment, it felt like we were breaking free, the sub lurching upwards. I dared to hope, but then there was another impact. Harder this time. The creature wasn't letting go. It was relentless, its grip tightening with each passing second. The sound of metal groaning filled my ears, followed by a new, more terrifying sound. The slow, steady hiss of water beginning to seep in through the cracks in the hull. I could see Jake's face in the dim emergency lights, pale and ghost-like, his eyes wide with fear. "We're not going to make it," he whispered, his voice trembling. And for a second, I believed him. I could feel the cold water around my feet, rising slowly, inexorably. The sub was compromised, and there was nothing we could do. I reached for the radio, my hands trembling, trying to send out a distress signal, but all I got was static. The creature was squeezing us, crushing us, dragging us deeper into its lair. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure eased. The creature released us, and I felt the sub lurch upward again as it began its ascent. I didn't dare breathe, didn't dare hope. The darkness outside was still impenetrable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, lurking, watching, waiting. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and the pressure gauge slowly ticked down. We were ascending, but the damage to the sub was severe. The control panel sparked, and I could hear the groan of the strained metal all around us. I kept one hand on the controls, trying to keep us steady, the other on Jake's arm. trying to offer some small comfort. Suddenly, the emergency lights flickered back on, casting a dim red glow through the cabin. I could see Jake's face clearly now, eyes wide with terror, his breaths coming in rapid gasps. I tried to speak, to reassure him, but before I could, a new sound filled the cabin. A deep guttural moan that resonated through the very metal of the sub. It wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from within. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, and saw something moving in the shadows at the rear of the sub. A slick, black tentacle, covered in spines, slithered across the floor, moving with a deliberate, almost intelligent purpose. It was inside. The creature had gotten inside. Jake screamed as the tentacle wrapped around his leg, yanking him off his feet. His scream was a high-pitched wail of pure terror, and it cut off abruptly as he was pulled into the darkness. I lunged for him, grabbing his arm, trying to hold on, but the creature was too strong. It pulled him toward the back of the sub, into the shadows. I could feel his grip slipping, his fingers clawing at my hand, and then he was gone, his screams echoing through the narrow corridors fading into a horrifying silence. I was alone now, the only sound my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of the sub's damaged engines. I knew I had to get out, had to reach the surface, but I could feel it, the thing inside the sub, moving closer. I crawled toward the control panel, my heart racing, every instinct screaming at me to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The tentacle lashed out again, wrapping around my ankle, pulling me back. I grabbed onto the control panel, fighting with everything I had, but it was no use. I could feel its cold, wet grip tightening, pulling me toward the rear of the sub, toward the darkness where Jake had disappeared. My hands slipped, and I was dragged back, my fingernails scraping against the metal as I was pulled into the waiting maw of the abyss. But the darkness didn't end. It was alive, swallowing me whole. I was pulled through a membrane, a slick, oily substance that clung to my skin, burning like acid. I tried to scream, but my lungs were filling with something thick and viscous, choking me, suffocating me. I could feel my body being pulled apart, piece by piece, my skin tearing away, my bones bending and snapping under the pressure. I was still conscious, somehow aware of every moment of agony, every rip and tear of my flesh. My mind was fracturing, splintering under the weight of the pain, but I couldn't pass out. The creature wouldn't let me. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own body, forced to endure every second of torment. I could hear them now, voices whispering in the darkness, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. They were soft at first, like a distant murmur, but they grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with their alien words. I felt them probing my mind, searching, digging through my memories, my thoughts. They were inside me, invading every corner of my being, and I could do nothing to stop them. I felt my consciousness slipping, my thoughts fading into the darkness. I was becoming a part of it, merging with the creature, my mind dissolving into its endless, hungry void. The last thing I saw before everything went black was a single, massive, eye-opening in the darkness, staring directly at me, its gaze filled with a cold, unfeeling hunger. And then there was nothing, only the darkness, the whispers, and the endless, suffocating void. I had always been fascinated by shipwrecks, their stories buried beneath the waves, relics of a bygone era lying silent and forgotten. Each wreck was like a time capsule, a frozen moment from history waiting to be uncovered. So when I heard about a newly discovered wreck off the coast of Bermuda, a place already notorious for strange occurrences. I knew I had to see it for myself. The locals called it the Ghost Ship, a centuries-old frigate that had vanished without a trace, rumored to be cursed. They spoke of it in hushed tones, warning of strange lights at night, of eerie sounds carried on the wind, of divers who had gone down and never returned. But I didn't believe in curses. I believed in history, in uncovering the past, in bringing stories back to the surface. We anchored our boat over the site under a leaden sky, the air thick with tension. As I prepared to descend, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sea was too calm, the horizon too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I shook off the unease and plunged into the deep, dark waters, the world above disappearing as the ocean closed over me. The water grew colder the deeper I went, the sunlight fading until it was nothing but a distant memory. The wreck appeared out of the gloom, like a ghost materializing from the darkness, its once proud masts now twisted and broken, its hull covered in centuries of barnacles and seaweed. The ship seemed almost alive, a decaying corpse of wood and iron resting in its watery grave. I swam closer, my flashlight cutting through the murky water, revealing the ship's name, the Morwenna, letters barely visible beneath layers of grime and sea growth. As I moved deeper into the wreck, the oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of my breathing, loud and ragged in the stillness. The passages were narrow, the walls closing in around me, each stroke of my flippers stirring up clouds of silt that hung in the water like a shroud. I should have felt excitement. This was what I live for. Exploring the untouched, the unknown. But all I felt was a growing sense of dread, a gnawing unease that twisted my stomach into knots. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My skin prickled with a cold sweat, despite the frigid water surrounding me. Every time I turned my head, I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that seemed to flit just beyond the reach of my light, disappearing when I tried to focus on them. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears, too loud, too fast. I was starting to question whether coming here alone had been a mistake, but I pressed on, driven by a need to see what secrets the ship held. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, so faint I thought I'd imagined it at first, like a voice carried on the current. I froze, holding my breath, straining to listen. The whisper came again, clearer this time, a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo through the water, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Perhaps it was the wind above, or the sound of the ocean itself, but deep down, I knew it was neither. This was something else, something wrong. I turned around and that's when I saw them. Shadows moving in the darkness, figures flitting in and out of the corner of my vision. Panic gripped me, and I spun around. My flashlight beam sweeping across the wreck, but there was nothing there. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, fogging up my mask. I had to get out. I turned to swim back to the surface, but the way was blocked. The passage I had come through was gone, replaced by a solid wall of twisted metal and rotting wood. My heart leapt into my throat. I was trapped. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, filling my ears with a chorus of voices, each one overlapping the other until it was a maddening cacophony. I could see them now, the ghostly figures moving toward me, their eyes empty, their faces twisted in agony. Their bodies were transparent, barely more than shadows, but the pain etched into their features was all too real. I tried to swim away, but my limbs felt heavy, like they were being pulled down by invisible hands. The water around me grew colder, and I could feel their touch. Cold, clammy fingers brushing against my skin, leaving a trail of icy numbness in their wake. figures drew closer, their whispers turning into an unintelligible chant, a language I couldn't understand, but that filled me with a deep, primal terror. Their faces were inches from mine now, their empty eyes boring into my soul, and I could feel their rage, their sorrow, their endless despair. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, only a stream of bubbles rising uselessly to the surface far above. Then, I felt it. A sudden sharp pain in my chest, like a knife twisting in my heart. I gasped, my mouth filling with water, choking me as I struggled to breathe. The pain intensified, spreading through my body like wildfire, burning through my veins, searing my flesh. I could feel my heart pounding faster and faster, as if it were trying to escape my chest. My vision blurred, the world around me dissolving into a swirl of dark shapes and distant lights. But the faces remained, clear and sharp, their expressions twisted with a mix of anger and sorrow. They were dragging me down, pulling me deeper into the wreck, into the cold, dark depths where no light could reach. My body was paralyzed, my mind screaming in terror, but I couldn't move, couldn't fight back. I was sinking into the abyss, the water growing colder, thicker, until it felt like I was drowning in tar. The last thing I saw before everything went black was their faces, horrifically close, twisted and contorted with the agony of the damned. Their mouths opened in a silent scream, and I could feel their rage, their despair, their endless hunger. They were not going to let me go. I was theirs now, another lost soul to join them in the eternal darkness of the ocean floor. As I slipped into unconsciousness, I felt their presence surround me, pressing in on all sides, suffocating me with their cold, clammy touch. The darkness closed in, wrapping around me like a shroud, and I could feel my mind unraveling, splintering into 1,000 pieces as the voices continued to whisper, growing louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear, all I could think about. I was lost, trapped in the endless, suffocating void, a prisoner of the ghosts of the deep. And then there was nothing, only the cold, the dark, and the whispers of the dead echoing through the abyss, forever.
I was an experienced diver, or at least I thought I was. I had plunged into some of the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean, swum through shipwrecks lost to time, and braved waters where few dared to venture. When the opportunity arose to explore a newly discovered coral reef in the South Pacific, I jumped at the chance. The locals, old men with weathered faces and eyes that seemed to hold centuries of secrets, warned us not to go. They said the reef was cursed, a place where the dead gathered, where the ocean itself had a dark, insatiable hunger. We laughed it off. We were scientists, after all. We didn't believe in curses. We believed in data, in exploration, in the thrill of discovery. The day of the dive, the sky was a brilliant blue, the sea calm and inviting. We prepared our gear, excitement buzzing in the air. The water was warm and clear as we descended, the sunlight filtering down in shimmering beams, creating a dazzling display of light and shadow. The reef was beautiful, a kaleidoscope of colors, filled with vibrant coral and schools of fish darting around like living jewels. For the first few minutes, it was everything we had hoped for, a paradise hidden beneath the waves. But as we swam deeper, the colors began to fade. The vivid reds, yellows, and blues of the coral dimmed, replaced by a dull, gray hue that seemed to suck the life out of everything. The water grew colder, a chill that cut through my wetsuit and sank into my bones. I felt a strange pressure building in my chest, a heaviness that made each breath harder to take. I glanced over at my partner, Ethan, his face hidden behind his mask, and saw the same look of confusion mirrored in his eyes. Then I saw it, a massive structure rising up from the seabed, covered in a thick layer of coral and seaweed. It loomed in the murky depths like a dark shadow, its shape distorted by the water. At first, I thought it was a rock formation, some natural wonder hidden away for centuries. But as I got closer, my heart began to race. It wasn't rock at all. It was bone. Hundreds, maybe thousands of human bones, bleached white and fused together, forming a grotesque monument in the shape of a twisted, hollow tower. Skulls, femurs, ribs, all interwoven with coral, a macabre tapestry of death and decay. A wave of nausea washed over me, the bile rising in my throat. My mind raced with questions, each one more horrifying than the last. How could this be here? How had no one found it before? I turned to signal to Ethan, but he was gone. Panic surged through me, and I spun around, my eyes darting through the gloom. But there was no sign of him, just the vast, empty ocean stretching out in all directions, an endless void that seemed to go on forever. My breath quickened, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to stay calm, to think rationally, but every instinct was screaming at me to get out. I kicked hard, swimming back toward the surface, desperate to escape the cold, suffocating darkness. But no matter how hard I swam, I couldn't seem to get any closer. The surface was right there, a patch of light just out of reach, but it was like I was swimming in place, trapped in a nightmare where escape was just a cruel illusion. Then I felt it, a cold, bony hand gripping my ankle, pulling me down. I froze, a scream caught in my throat. I looked down and saw them, figures made of bone and coral, their bodies twisted and broken, their empty eye sockets staring up at me, their mouths open in silent screams. Their skeletal fingers were wrapped around my leg, their grip impossibly strong. I thrashed and kicked, panic overtaking me, but it was no use. They were pulling me down toward the tower, toward the darkness that seemed to pulse like a living thing. I could feel their cold, clammy touch on my skin, the sensation like ice burning through my wetsuit. The figures moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their bodies floating through the water as if they were weightless. Their eyes were black pits, empty and soulless, but I could feel their gaze, feel their hatred, their anger. They were the dead, the lost souls trapped in the reef, and they were not going to let me go. I screamed, bubbles streaming from my mouth, but no sound came out. The water grew colder, darker, the light from above fading until it was nothing but a distant memory. The bones were closing in around me, pressing against my skin, crushing me. I could feel the jagged edges cutting into my flesh, feel the pressure building in my chest, my lungs burning with the need for air. My vision blurred, my head spinning as the world around me dissolved into darkness. And then I heard them, the whispers, 1,000 voices speaking in unison, their words a haunting chorus that echoed through the water, filling my mind with their dark song. They were calling me, beckoning me to join them in the reef of bones. Their voices were soft, almost soothing, but there was a darkness to them, a cold, unfeeling malice that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to fight it, tried to swim away, but my limbs felt heavy, my body numb and unresponsive. The cold was seeping into my bones, freezing me from the inside out. I could feel my strength fading, my will to fight slipping away. The figures were all around me now, their hands reaching out, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I could see their faces, their empty eyes staring into mine, their mouths twisted into grotesque smiles. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, like a knife twisting in my heart. I gasped, my mouth filling with water, choking me as I struggled to breathe. I could feel my heart slowing, my vision narrowing to a single point of light far above me. The pain was overwhelming, a searing agony that tore through my body, but I couldn't scream, couldn't move. I was trapped, sinking into the cold, dark abyss, my body limp and lifeless. As the darkness closed in, I felt their hands on me, pulling me down, deeper into the reef. I could see the tower now, its twisted form looming above me, a monument to the dead. The voices were louder, more insistent, their chant echoing through the water, filling my mind with their dark, terrible song. I could feel their presence, feel their cold, unyielding grip on my soul. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the tower, the bones shifting and writhing like a living thing. I could see faces in the coral twisted and contorted with pain, their mouths open in silent screams. I was one of them now, another lost soul to join the dead in their eternal dance beneath the waves. I felt my body dissolve, my mind fading into the darkness, and then there was nothing, only the cold, the dark, and the whispers of the dead, calling me to join them in the reef of bones.
We were deep-sea fishermen, my crew and I, hardened by years of braving the unforgiving waters of the ocean. We were accustomed to the dangers of the deep, the unpredictable storms, the monstrous waves, and the elusive creatures lurking below. But nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered that night, far out at sea, in waters few dared to venture, waters that even seasoned sailors whispered about in fear. The moon was hidden behind thick, swirling clouds, casting the ocean into a deep, impenetrable black. The only light came from the dim lamps on our boat, flickering uncertainly, as if sensing the unease that had settled over us. We were anchored, our lines cast deep, waiting for the elusive catch that had brought us so far from shore. The sea was strangely calm, unnaturally so, as if holding its breath, waiting. The air was thick, heavy, with an unspoken tension that seemed to weigh on our shoulders, making every breath feel labored. Then, without warning, we felt it, a sudden, violent jolt that nearly capsized our boat. The deck lurched beneath our feet, sending equipment flying and men sprawling. We scrambled to the side, peering over the edge into the inky blackness below. Something massive was moving beneath us, circling, disturbing the calm surface with a slow, methodical rhythm. I could feel it, a presence, ancient and malevolent, lurking just out of sight. It was as if the very ocean was holding its breath, waiting for whatever horror lay beneath to make its move. The water was eerily still, the only sound the soft lapping of the waves against the hull. But that calm was deceptive. I could see it in the eyes of my crew, the way their hands trembled as they gripped the rail, the way their breaths came in shallow, fearful gasps. They were whispering nervously among themselves, old stories and superstitions bubbling to the surface. I tried to keep them calm, to remind them that we were seasoned men, that there was nothing in these waters we couldn't handle. But even as I spoke, I could feel the fear creeping in, a cold, insidious dread that settled deep in my bones. Then we saw it, a shadow, impossibly large, passing beneath the boat. It was too big to be a whale, too fast to be a shark. It moved with a deliberate, almost predatory grace, like a hunter stalking its prey. The boat rocked violently as it brushed against us, and I caught a glimpse of a massive black eye staring up from the depths. It was filled with an unsettling intelligence, an awareness that sent a shiver down my spine. This was no ordinary sea creature. This was something else, something far more terrifying. Before I could react, a giant tentacle shot out of the water, slick and glistening in the dim light, wrapping around the mast and snapping it like a twig. The sound was deafening, a crack like thunder that echoed across the empty sea. The crew screamed, scrambling to get away, but the tentacle moved with terrifying speed, snaking across the deck and grabbing one of the men. His scream was a high-pitched wail of pure terror, cut short as he was lifted into the air, his body flailing helplessly. In a blur of water and foam, he was pulled under, disappearing beneath the surface in an instant. The ocean swallowed him whole, and his screams were cut off, leaving only a deafening silence. Panic erupted on deck. Men shouted and cursed, their faces pale with fear, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. We tried to start the engine, to get away, but another tentacle lashed out, crushing the stern with a sickening crunch. The boat was being torn apart around us, wood splintering, metal groaning under the immense pressure. I grabbed a harpoon, one of the few weapons we had, and aimed at the shadow below. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, but I forced myself to steady. I fired, the spear slicing through the water, but it was like throwing a toothpick at a mountain. The shadow didn't even flinch. The boat lurched again, tilting violently to one side as another tentacle wrapped around the hull, pulling us down. Water rushed over the deck, cold and relentless, and I could hear the groaning of wood and metal as the boat began to break apart. I was thrown overboard, plunged into the freezing water. The shock of the cold stole the breath from my lungs, and for a moment, I was paralyzed, my limbs numb and unresponsive. I struggled to the surface, gasping for air, and saw the boat disappearing into the blackness, the crew still screaming, their voices filled with terror and despair. I tried to swim away, to get as far from the sinking boat as possible, but something caught my leg, pulling me under. I fought, kicking and thrashing, but it was like being caught in a vice. The grip tightened, pulling me deeper and deeper, the light fading above me, until it was just a distant, flickering glow. I could see it now, the creature, a massive, hulking shape, with a maw that seemed to stretch forever, filled with rows of jagged teeth that gleamed in the darkness. Its body was a mass of writhing tentacles, each one covered in slimy, glistening suckers that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The creature's eye, that massive, unblinking eye, was locked onto me, filled with a cold, calculating intelligence. It watched me struggle, watched me fight, and I could feel its amusement, its dark, twisted pleasure at my fear. It opened its mouth wider, a gaping maw that seemed to suck in all the light, all the warmth, all the hope. I could see rows upon rows of teeth, each one razor sharp, dripping with some dark, oily substance that burned like acid in the water. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, only a stream of bubbles rising uselessly to the surface. The tentacle tightened around my leg, pulling me closer, and I could feel the pressure building in my chest, my lungs burning with the need for air. I clawed at the water, my fingers scraping against the slick, cold flesh of the creature, but it was no use. I was being pulled into the darkness, into the waiting maw of the abyss. As I was dragged deeper, the water grew colder, the darkness more complete. I could feel the crushing weight of the ocean pressing in on me, squeezing the life from my body. My vision blurred, my mind fogging with the lack of oxygen, and I knew I was dying. The creature's mouth was inches away now, its breath, a foul, putrid stench that filled my lungs, choking me, suffocating me. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the creature's mouth closing around me, its teeth slicing into my flesh, its tongue, a slick, slimy thing, wrapping around my body, pulling me deeper into its gullet. I could feel my bones snapping, my skin tearing, and then there was nothing, only darkness, the cold, inky black of the ocean swallowing me whole. I was aware, even in the darkness, even in the pain. I could feel myself being pulled deeper and deeper into the creature, my body breaking apart, dissolving in its acidic insides. I could hear my crew, their screams echoing around me, each one a tortured wail that seemed to go on forever. I could feel their pain, their fear, their despair, and I knew I was trapped in the belly of the beast, forever. And then I felt it, a presence, ancient and malevolent, surrounding me, invading my mind. I could feel it probing, searching, pulling at my memories, my thoughts, my very soul. It was inside me, consuming me, devouring everything I was, everything I had ever been. I was no longer myself. I was a part of it, a part of the darkness, a part of the deep, endless void. I wanted to scream, to cry, to fight, but I had no voice, no body, no self. I was nothing, a whisper in the dark, a shadow in the deep. I could feel the creature's hunger, its endless, insatiable hunger, and I knew I would never escape, never see the light again. I was lost, lost to the darkness, lost to the deep, lost to the endless, eternal night of the ocean floor. And there, in the cold, dark depths, I would remain forever.
I was part of a seasoned salvage crew, hired to recover a sunken treasure ship off the treacherous coast of Norway. The ship had gone down centuries ago, lost to the icy grip of the North Sea, and was rumored to be filled with gold and jewels. It was a legendary find, one that had lured many before us into these perilous waters, only to leave them empty-handed or worse, lost to the depths themselves. We had been searching for weeks with no luck, and the crew's morale was low, each day that passed without discovery weighing heavier on our spirits. Some whispered that the ship was just a myth, a ghost story told to keep foolhardy treasure hunters at bay. But then, one stormy night, our sonar picked up something, an anomaly on the ocean floor deeper than any of us had expected. We prepared to descend in our submersible, the cold wind howling above as if warning us away. I felt a knot of anxiety twist in my stomach, a sense of dread I couldn't shake, but the promise of treasure outweighed my fear. As we began our descent, the ocean around us grew darker and colder with every passing meter, the surface light fading until we were enveloped in an impenetrable black. The sonar blipped steadily, a constant eerie reminder of our proximity to the sunken ship. My breath fogged up the inside of my helmet, and I had to remind myself to stay calm, to focus. The deeper we went, the more the temperature plummeted, the cold seeping into our bones despite the layers of our diving suits. And then, out of the abyss, we saw it. A massive ancient ship lying on its side, its hull half buried in the silt of the ocean floor. It was covered in a thick layer of silt and barnacles, its once proud form now a shadow of its former glory. The ship was larger than we'd imagined, its twisted masts reaching out like skeletal fingers clawing toward the surface, desperate for freedom. The sight of it sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. As we approached, I felt a strange sensation in my head, a pressure, like something was trying to push its way into my mind. It was subtle at first, a dull throb at the back of my skull, but as we drew closer, it grew more intense. I shook my head, trying to clear the feeling, dismissing it as a side effect of the depth, of the stress of the dive. But the feeling persisted, a creeping sense of unease that settled over me like a dark cloud. We moved closer, shining our lights into the wreck. The beams cut through the murky water, revealing a haunting scene, a labyrinth of broken beams, shattered wood, and torn sails, all covered in a thick, muddy sludge. The interior was a tangled mess, a dark, rotting maze that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, amidst the wreckage, I saw something glinting in the darkness. Gold. My heart leapt in my chest. The legends were true. The ship was filled with treasure. But as we ventured deeper into the wreck, the pressure in my head grew worse, the throbbing turning into a sharp, stabbing pain. I could hear whispers now, faint at first, just a murmur on the edge of my consciousness, but growing louder, more insistent with every passing second. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, swirling around me, echoing in my skull. I turned to my partner, Ethan, but he was staring blankly ahead, his eyes wide with terror, his face pale and drawn. I followed his gaze and saw them, figures moving through the darkness, their bodies twisted and broken, their eyes glowing with a sickly green light. They moved with a slow, unnatural grace, their limbs contorted in impossible angles, their expressions blank and hollow. They were the crew, or what was left of them, trapped in a state between life and death, their souls bound to the wreck by some ancient curse. I could hear their voices now, a cacophony of whispers, screaming in my mind. They were speaking to me, calling me, pleading with me to join them in their watery tomb. I tried to turn back, to pull us out of there, but the sub wouldn't respond. The controls were dead, the lights flickering.
We were on a sailing trip across the Atlantic, my friends and I, enjoying the vast, open sea and the intoxicating freedom it offered. It was supposed to be an adventure, a break from our mundane lives. For a week, we laughed, drank, and shared stories under the clear, star-filled sky. But on the seventh night, everything changed. That's when we first noticed the fog. It came out of nowhere, creeping across the water like a living thing, a thick, impenetrable mist that swallowed the horizon and blotted out the stars. At first we thought it was just a freak weather event, a harmless fog bank rolling in. But then the temperature dropped and the air turned icy cold, colder than I'd ever felt in the middle of the ocean. I could see my breath hanging in the air, each exhale a misty plume. The sea, which had been calm just moments before, began to churn violently. The waves grew higher, slapping against the hull with a force that sent shudders through the boat. We tried to steer clear of the fog, to find a way around it, but it was everywhere. A living, breathing wall that closed in on us from all sides. No matter which way we turned, the fog thickened. The air grew colder, and the sea became more treacherous. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white, my heart pounding in my chest. The crew huddled together, fear etched on their faces, their voices low and tense. And then we saw it. A ship emerging from the mist, barely visible through the fog. It moved silently, gliding across the water like a ghost. It was an old, battered vessel, its sails torn and tattered, hanging limp from broken masts. The hull was blackened, covered in barnacles and seaweed, as if it had been at the bottom of the ocean for centuries. My stomach twisted in knots, a deep primal fear seizing me. We tried to hail it, our voices cracking through the still air, but there was no response. The ship drew closer, and I could see figures on the deck moving slowly, like shadows. They were dressed in old, tattered clothes, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes empty. They moved with a strange, jerky motion, like puppets on strings, their limbs twisting in unnatural ways. The fog grew thicker around us, the air colder still, and I could feel a strange, oppressive weight pressing down on me, a suffocating presence that seemed to crawl under my skin. The ship was almost upon us now, and I could see the figures more clearly. They were sailors, or what was left of them, their bodies decayed and rotting, chunks of flesh missing, their bones exposed in places. Their eyes glowed with a faint, eerie light, a sickly green that sent a chill down my spine. They were staring at us, their mouths open in silent screams that seemed to echo in my mind. We tried to turn, to get away, but the sea had become a roiling cauldron of waves and spray. The boat pitched violently, nearly capsizing as the waves crashed over the bow. I could feel the cold spray on my face, each drop like a needle against my skin. The ghost ship was upon us now, its bow crashing into ours with a bone-jarring impact. The figures reached out, their hands clawing at the air, pulling themselves onto our deck with a speed that defied their decayed appearance. They moved toward us, their empty eyes fixed on us, their mouths moving silently as if chanting some dark incantation. I tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The fog was all around us, thick and suffocating, and the sea was a boiling chaos of waves and foam. I could feel their cold, clammy hands on me, pulling me down, their grip like iron. Their touch burned with a cold that went straight to my bones, freezing my blood in my veins. I fought, kicking and screaming, but it was like struggling against a nightmare. The more I fought, the tighter their grip became. They were pulling me toward the edge of the boat, toward the dark, churning water below. I could feel the deck slipping away beneath my feet, feel the cold ocean spray against my face. The last thing I saw was the sea rising up to meet me, the cold water closing over my head, and then darkness. I could feel the water rushing into my lungs as I was pulled deeper into the icy depths. The cold was unbearable, numbing every part of my body until I could no longer feel anything but the crushing pressure of the ocean. The last traces of light from above faded quickly, swallowed by the thick fog that seemed to stretch even beneath the waves. I tried to scream, but my mouth filled with seawater, my cries lost in the cold, dark silence. I opened my eyes, desperate to see something, anything, but the water was pitch black. I could feel their hands still gripping me, the cold, dead touch of the ghostly sailors pulling me further into the abyss. Their faces appeared before me, faintly illuminated by an unnatural glow, eyes hollow and empty. Their mouths opened and closed in silent screams, but I couldn't hear them. I could only feel the pressure of their presence weighing down on me, pressing me deeper into the darkness. My lungs burned as I struggled to hold my breath, but I knew I couldn't last much longer. Panic set in, my thoughts becoming frantic and disjointed. I tried to fight back, kicking and thrashing against their grip, but it was like struggling against the current of a raging river. The ghostly sailors were unyielding, their strength far beyond anything I could hope to resist. I could feel the ocean floor beneath me, cold and rough, as they dragged me across the seabed. I reached out, my fingers scraping against the sand and rock, trying to find something to hold on to, something to stop my descent, but there was nothing. Just endless darkness, and the feeling of being pulled into a place where no light or life could ever reach. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the dragging stopped. The hands released me, and I felt myself suspended in the water, weightless. I looked around, my vision blurred by the salt water, and saw the sailors retreating into the darkness, their forms dissolving into the blackness. I was alone, drifting in the void, the pressure of the deep ocean pressing in on all sides. I felt a surge of fear, realizing I was still sinking, slowly but surely descending into the bottomless depths of the ocean. My lungs screamed for air, my chest heaving in desperate spasms. I tried to swim upward, but my limbs were heavy, unresponsive. The cold had sapped all my strength, and I knew I was out of time. Just as I was about to give in, to let the ocean take me, I saw a light. Faint and flickering, it was coming from somewhere far below. It was impossible. There was no light in the depths, nothing but darkness and death. But there it was, glowing steadily, like a beacon. With the last of my strength, I began to swim toward it, my movements slow and labored. The light grew brighter, more intense, and I could see now that it was coming from a small crevice in the ocean floor. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the edges of the rock, and pulled myself closer, drawn to the warmth and light. As I got nearer, I felt a strange sensation, like a warmth spreading through my body, driving away the cold and numbness. I reached out to touch the light, desperate to feel something other than the icy darkness. But as my fingers grazed the surface, I felt a sudden jolt, like a shockwave, and everything went white. I blinked, gasping for air, and realized I was no longer underwater. I was lying on a beach, the soft sand beneath me warm and dry. I could hear the gentle lapping of the waves and the distant cries of seabirds. I sat up, coughing and sputtering, my lungs burning with the effort, and looked around. The fog was gone, and the sky above was clear and blue. I could see the wreck of our boat not far down the shore, its hull cracked and broken. There was no sign of my friends, no sign of the ghost ship or the phantom sailors. It was as if it had all been a terrible dream. I stood up, my legs shaky, and took a few tentative steps toward the water. The ocean looked calm, serene, but I knew better. I could feel it still, the cold, dark presence lurking beneath the surface, waiting. I turned and began to walk away from the shore, my mind reeling with the horrors I had witnessed. As I walked, I felt something wet and cold drip down my face. I reached up, wiping it away, and saw that it was seawater. I froze, my heart pounding, and slowly turned back toward the ocean. The tide was receding, pulling back into the deep, dark depths, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, a shadow, moving just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. And then I felt it, a cold, bony hand gripping my ankle, pulling me back toward the sea. I looked down, my breath catching in my throat, and saw a ghostly, translucent hand wrapped around my leg, its fingers digging into my flesh. The fog began to roll in again, thicker and darker than before, and I could hear the distant sound of a ship's bell, tolling mournfully through the mist. I didn't wait to find out what was happening. I turned and ran as fast as I could, away from the shore, away from the ocean. But I knew deep down that I would never truly escape. The ocean had marked me, claimed me as its own, and one day it would come for me again, dragging me back into its cold, dark depths, where I would join the ghostly crew of that cursed ship, forever lost in the fog and the sea.